There is a reason, and almost nobody sees it. Most people spend their lives believing they were born weaker than everyone else. They look at confident people and quietly assume they were simply built differently. They admire those who speak without hesitation, those who walk away without looking back, those who seem untouched by criticism, untouched by rejection, untouched by fear. And somewhere deep inside, a painful conclusion begins to form. Maybe I've always been weak. It feels like an honest observation. After all, the evidence seems overwhelming. You overthink, you hesitate, you replay conversations, you struggle to say no. You carry guilt that other people seem able to forget. Surely that must mean something is wrong with you. But psychology suggests something far more unsettling. What if weakness was never your true nature? What if it was only the role your nervous system learned to play? Because there is something extraordinary about the human mind. It adapts, not to become successful, not to become admired, but to survive. And sometimes, survival looks remarkably similar to weakness. Imagine a tree growing in an open field. It stretches confidently toward the sky. Its branches spread without hesitation. Now imagine another tree, growing beneath towering trees that block almost every ray of sunlight. It bends, twists, changes direction. Not because it is weaker, because it is adapting to its environment. Would you call that tree defective? Or would you recognize that it simply learned to survive under different conditions? Human beings are no different. Children are not born believing they should stay quiet. They learn. They are not born apologizing for taking up space. They learn. They are not born fearing rejection. They learn. Somewhere, the environment quietly begins teaching lessons that no classroom ever could. Lessons about safety, acceptance, belonging, love, power, and perhaps the most important lesson of all: who must I become to avoid getting hurt? That question changes everything, because once the mind discovers a strategy that reduces pain, it remembers it. Not as an option, as a rule. The child who learned that speaking honestly created conflict discovers silence. The child who learned that mistakes invited humiliation discovers perfectionism. The child who learned that saying no disappointed people discovers people-pleasing. At first, these strategies work. Conflict decreases, approval increases. The child feels safer, but safety always comes with a hidden price. Every strategy that protects you also shapes you. Slowly, the behavior becomes automatic. So automatic that years later, you mistake adaptation for identity. You no longer say, "I learned to stay quiet." You simply say, "I'm shy." You no longer say, "I learned to put everyone else first." You simply say, "That's just who I am." The strategy disappears. Only the personality remains. This is where one of psychology's greatest misunderstandings begins. People often confuse adaptation with character. They see someone avoiding confrontation and call them weak. They see someone struggling to trust and call them broken. They see someone who cannot leave unhealthy relationships and call them emotionally dependent. But what if those behaviors were never signs of weakness? What if they were signs of extraordinary adaptation? Because every survival strategy once solved a problem. Every people pleaser was once a child trying to keep peace. Every perfectionist was once a child trying to avoid criticism. Every overthinker was once a child trying to predict danger before it arrived. None of these children believed they were becoming weak. They believed they were becoming safe. And for a time, they were right. This is why judging yourself without understanding your history is one of the greatest acts of unfairness you can commit against yourself. You are criticizing solutions that once kept you alive emotionally. Imagine thanking a life jacket for saving you during a storm, then refusing to remove it years later, while standing safely on dry land. The life jacket was never the problem. The problem was believing the storm never ended. Many people continue living exactly this way, still wearing emotional protection, long after the danger has disappeared, still expecting abandonment from people who have never abandoned them, still apologizing before anyone has accused them, still shrinking themselves in rooms that never asked them to become smaller. The past quietly continues directing the present, not because the past is stronger, because the nervous system still believes it is current. This explains something that confuses many people. Why do intelligent, kind, capable individuals often struggle to believe in themselves? The answer is not a lack of strength. It is the persistence of old instructions, instructions written by experiences that no longer exist. But if those instructions were learned, can they also be rewritten? And if you were never truly weak, then who convinced you that you were? It is a difficult question, not because the answer is hidden, because it is often woven into experiences so ordinary they no longer seem important. Rarely does someone wake up one morning believing they are inadequate. That belief is usually built one moment at a time, one comparison, one disappointment, one criticism, one impossible expectation. None of them appear powerful enough on their own. Yet together, they quietly construct an identity. Imagine placing a single drop of water onto a stone. Nothing changes. Place another. Still nothing. Repeat the process for years, and even stone begins to wear away. The human mind is no different. Identity is rarely transformed by one dramatic event. It is shaped by repeated emotional experiences. This is why the words spoken most often during childhood are often the words people continue speaking to themselves as adults. Be careful. Don't embarrass yourself. You're too sensitive. Why can't you be more like your brother? You're never satisfied. You always make things difficult. At first, these are simply voices around you. Eventually, they become the voice inside you. Without realizing it, the mind begins rehearsing conversations that ended years ago. Not because it enjoys criticism, because familiarity creates certainty, and certainty feels safe. There is something fascinating about the human brain. It would often rather experience familiar discomfort than unfamiliar freedom. Because freedom contains uncertainty. Uncertainty requires trust, and trust is difficult for a nervous system raised to expect danger. This explains why so many people remain inside emotional patterns they claim to hate. Not because they secretly enjoy suffering, because suffering they understand feels safer than peace they have never experienced. Think about someone who spent childhood constantly trying to avoid conflict. As an adult, they struggle to express disagreement. Every difficult conversation feels dangerous, not because disagreement is actually dangerous, because the nervous system remembers another time when disagreement carried emotional consequences. The body reacts first. The mind explains later. This is one of the greatest misunderstandings about confidence. People believe confidence is a personality trait. Psychology suggests something different. Confidence is often the nervous system's belief that it can survive uncertainty. Read that again. Confidence is not believing nothing bad will happen. It is believing, even if something bad happens, I'll be okay. There is an enormous difference. The first requires controlling the world. The second requires trusting yourself. And perhaps that trust is what many people were never given the opportunity to develop. Because every time someone solved every problem for you, or criticized every mistake, or made love feel conditional, the mind quietly learned another lesson. I cannot trust myself. That belief becomes incredibly persuasive, not because it is true, because it has been repeated. This is why people sometimes ask 10 different friends for advice before making one simple decision. Not because they lack intelligence, because somewhere inside, they stopped believing their own judgment could be trusted. Have you ever noticed how some people apologize before they even begin speaking? Sorry if this sounds stupid. I might be wrong. This is probably a bad idea. Those words appear harmless, yet they reveal something profound. The person is preparing for rejection before anyone has rejected them. They are protecting themselves from a danger that has not yet appeared. Protection has become automatic. This is not weakness, it is anticipation. The mind is attempting to prevent emotional pain before emotional pain exists. Remarkably, many of the qualities people criticize about themselves are actually evidence of extraordinary psychological intelligence. The overthinker notices patterns. The highly sensitive person notices emotional shifts. The people pleaser notices everyone else's needs. The perfectionist notices details others completely miss. None of these abilities are inherently destructive. They only become painful when they are driven by fear instead of choice. That changes everything. Perhaps you do not need to become a different person. Perhaps you only need to free the person you already are from the fear that has been directing them. Imagine a bird raised inside a cage. Years pass. Eventually, the cage door is opened. Yet the bird refuses to leave, not because it cannot fly, because the cage has become familiar. Many people unknowingly live inside invisible cages exactly like this. Cages built from old beliefs, old fears, old identities. The bars cannot be touched, yet they quietly shape every decision. I'm not good enough. People always leave. I shouldn't ask for too much. I have to prove my worth. None of these statements describe reality. They describe survival. And survival was never meant to become identity. But if weakness was only a strategy and not your true nature, what remains when the strategy is no longer needed? Who are you when fear is no longer making every decision? Perhaps that is the question your entire life has been quietly leading toward. Because every survival strategy eventually reaches a moment when it begins protecting you from a danger that no longer exists. The child who stayed silent becomes the adult who cannot speak their truth. The child who constantly sought approval becomes the adult who cannot make decisions without reassurance. The child who learned to disappear becomes the adult who feels invisible, even when standing in a crowded room. The strategy once reduced pain. Now, it creates it. This is the strange paradox of the human mind. The very behaviors that once helped you survive can eventually become the barriers preventing you from truly living. And yet, most people continue blaming themselves. Why am I like this? Why can't I just be stronger? Why does everyone else seem to have it figured out? Notice the assumption hidden inside those questions, the assumption that your mind is working against you. But what if it never was? What if your mind has been trying to protect you with outdated instructions? Imagine using an old map. Years ago, the roads were accurate, the directions were reliable, but cities changed. Bridges were built, roads disappeared, new paths emerged. The map did not become evil. It simply became outdated. Many people are still navigating adulthood with emotional maps created in childhood, maps that once led to safety but no longer lead to truth. The tragedy is not that the map exists. The tragedy is believing it is the only one. This is where awareness quietly changes everything. Because awareness does something fear cannot. It creates space. The moment you recognize, I learned this, instead of, this is who I am, identity begins to loosen. The prison door opens. Not because your past disappears, but because you finally realize you were never the prison itself. You were only living inside it. There is an extraordinary difference between saying, I am weak, and saying, I learned behaviors that once protected me. One statement becomes identity. The other becomes history. History can be understood. Identity feels permanent. This is why language matters far more than most people realize. Every time you describe yourself, your mind listens. I'm just an anxious person. I'm terrible with relationships. I've always lacked confidence. I'm too emotional. These sentences appear harmless, but repeated often enough, they quietly become emotional architecture. The mind begins building a life around them, not because they are objectively true, because they have been accepted without question. What if, instead of asking, what's wrong with me, you began asking, what did my mind have to learn in order to survive? That single question replaces judgment with curiosity. And curiosity has always been one of psychology's greatest tools, because people rarely heal through criticism. They heal through understanding. Imagine meeting your younger self, not the version of you standing here today, the child, the teenager, the one who first learned to stay quiet, to overthink, to please everyone, to apologize, to expect rejection. Would you honestly look into their eyes and say, you were weak? Or would you see something entirely different? A child trying to make sense of a world they didn't choose. A nervous system doing its very best with the information it had. A young mind creating strategies that allowed it to keep going. Perhaps, for the first time, you would recognize something you have overlooked for years. It took incredible strength to survive what taught you to doubt yourself. Read that again. Not weakness. Strength. Strength does not always look like confidence. Sometimes strength looks like enduring. Sometimes it looks like adapting. Sometimes it looks like carrying emotional weight that no child should ever have been asked to carry. The tragedy is that many survivors grow up believing their adaptations were evidence of failure, when in reality, they were evidence of remarkable resilience. Resilience is not always loud. It is often silent. It wakes up every morning, keeps moving, keeps hoping, keeps trying. Despite believing it isn't enough, that is not weakness, that is extraordinary endurance. But endurance is not the final destination. There comes a moment when surviving is no longer enough, when the life that once required protection begins asking for something different. Presence, freedom, authenticity, and those things require courage of another kind. The courage to disappoint people, the courage to say no, the courage to leave what no longer serves you, the courage to stop apologizing for existing, the courage to trust yourself, even while uncertainty remains. Perhaps that is what real strength has always been, not becoming fearless, but refusing to let fear decide who you are. Because strength is not measured by how little you feel. It is measured by your willingness to keep moving without abandoning yourself. And perhaps that has always been the misunderstanding. You spent years trying to become stronger when your greatest task was simply remembering the strength that carried you this far. Because there is one final truth, and almost nobody sees it. You were never weak. You were a human being who learned extraordinary ways to survive extraordinary experiences. Now, for the first time, you no longer need to spend your life proving how strong you are. You only need to become free enough to finally be yourself. Because understanding the mind is the first step toward understanding yourself.